Welcome, everyone. I'm Ujlaki. I'm a doctoral student at Corvinus University of Budapest, and I'm also an assistant research fellow at the Center of Social Sciences. In the presentation, I address a classical problem of political theory from an unusual viewpoint. The classical problem is the problem of political obligation, which addresses whether we must obey the law. In a more philosophical formulation, the issue is how the claim that the members of a society ought to obey the law and other authority claims of the state can be justifiable, if at all. In other words, do we have political obligations? And if we do, from what do they stem from? This question has received several answers from the philosophical anarchist approaches that deny the justifiability of political obligation, to the more optimistic theories that attempt to deduce political obligation from one or more moral principles. Interestingly, no theory has been proved successfully yet the existence of our political obligations. The uncommon viewpoint I add to this question is the perspective of the outsider, or more precisely, the migrant. The idea initiates from the intuition that if citizens have a political obligation to obey, then non-citizens who contact a particular state acquire at least some political obligations similar to citizens. A typical case for this is the migrant, including the archetype of immigrant, the temporary or seasonal worker of circular migration, the foreign student, the tourist, and even the victims of different types of forced migration. In sum, it is easy to acknowledge, if we are not philosophical anarchists at least, that when we are visiting a foreign country, there are some rules which we cannot violate, or at least their violation may involve sanctions. For example, driving through a red traffic light could involve penalty independently of the fact that we are violating the law this way at our home country or abroad. These types of questions are not only important from a practical viewpoint. From a philosophical perspective, I believe that my approach to extend the scope of inquiry concerning political obligation might help orient us in the wide variety of theories about political obligation, and it might highlight the advantages of certain approaches in spite of others. The structure of the presentation is as follows. I briefly present the problem of political obligation and the typical framing of the issue. Then I outline a possible classification of the most known theories of political obligations that can help us to identify the most appropriate theories that can ground and understand the obligations of non-citizens and migrants. Again, migrant figures here refer to all persons who, for some reason, have to move, usually through state borders. So I do not use this as a mere synonym of the immigrant, as the literature on migration usually does. So then, building on this classification, I will argue that the best suited class for this task contains the theories of a natural duty. And finally, I present three theories of this kind, and I argue which ones might contribute the most to examining the political obligations of non-citizens. Problem of political obligation, the classical problem. The conflict between the individual liberty of the members of the political community and the state's authority is an inescapable dilemma for political theorists. Classical approaches, of course, appeal to the either explicit or implicit voluntary consent of the subjected persons. However, this solution has been criticized primarily because it does not tell us a lot about the obligations of existing people. Therefore, the contemporary debate about which theory offers the best explanation about citizens' political obligation to obey the state generated an enormous literature of alternative theories on this topic. These optimistic theories aim to demonstrate that all citizens have an obligation to obey the law, and the state has a corresponding claim to authority over them. Usually, both advocates of political authority and skeptics measure the success of the theories by two criteria. It is widely accepted among political theorists that for being satisfactory, a theory must offer a political obligation that is content independent and must satisfy the particularity requirement. The criterion of content independence means that in order to be a matter of obligation, obedience to the claims of a government must be independent of the precise content of the required action. That is, one must obey the law because it is the law, and must obey all other authority claims of the state. For example, I should not drive through red traffic lights, but if I do and got caught, then I should not escape from police officers. The particularity requirement demands that the theory must show that the political obligation is aimed precisely at the state to which jurisdiction is the individual is subjected, and not to all states of the world, or to any chosen state, or to the state which regarded the best or the most just. There is something peculiar about the nature of how the problem is framed. As we could see so far, the question of political obligations is embodied in the relationship between the state and its citizens. Because of this, theorists often use a simplified, static view of the political community, and they disregard questions of inclusion and exclusion. Some theorists briefly reflect on the obligations of immigrants or tourists, but this is the less common case. However, similarly to contemporary critiques of mainstream political theory, I believe it is important for normative theory to address questions like authority, legitimacy, and obligation with a more dynamic view of the political community. This dynamic view of the community is based on the fact that the population is constantly changing. It considers that in modern states, there are several persons without citizenship rights. Therefore, rather than regarding them as the exception or an anomaly, it considers them as important subjects. And additionally, it is sensitive to the fact that these non-citizens are especially vulnerable to power abuses and coercion. As I mentioned, my main aim is to identify a class of theories that best suits a theory of political obligation that tells us something about the political obligations of non-citizens who get in contact with the state. For this reason, I sketch a threefold classification of existing theories according to the boundedness of their view of political community. The first class of theories contains approaches that presuppose a fully bounded view of the political community. Theories belonging to this category assume a fixed political community, and their question is whether all or nearly all, at least tacitly, consent to the authority of the state. In my view, theories of consent and gratitude belong here, but we can add communitarian versions of associative theories that appeal to identity or role. Although these theories may allow disobedience in renouncement of political obligations, these possibilities are only virtual. There are no real possibilities available for the subject in these theories for opting out. Thus, these are insufficient for elaborating a theory that aims at incorporating both the possibility of acquiring and renouncing political obligations and different levels of political obligations of migrant people. The second class contains theories with a partly bounded political community that take the fact of disobedience and the renouncement of political obligations seriously. Typically, theories of fairness and associative theories could be mentioned here. Theories applying the fairness principle or fair play often initiate from the unfair nature of free riding, that is, benefiting from the cooperative scheme without contributing to it. However, they allow for the possibility of different levels of obedience required in proportion to the acquired benefits. When considering the case of migrant figures, we could see that the fairness principle presumably offers us the possibility to assign different levels of required political obedience to non-citizens according to the net benefit they gain. Still, fairness theories are usually elaborated to demonstrate that nearly all subjects of the state receive some benefits from the social cooperation. Thus, they are obligated to obey. And this offers little explanation for us about how the political obligations of those who, by being migrant figures, minimally take part and scarcely benefit from the cooperative scheme. The same problem applies to approaches of associative theories that refer to the special relationship between members. Although these allow the possibility of including migrants and non-citizens into the argument, yet their main idea is precisely to explain political obligations as emerging from the fact of membership in the political association, rather than offering ideas about how to acquire membership and whether different levels of membership exist. For example, whether denizenship can be regarded as a type of membership. Therefore, although these theories might offer possibilities to incorporate the fact and implications of movement and migration, they are far from being convenient to explain the obedience of non-members. The third class of theories was a dynamic conception of the political community. Rather than appealing to our membership, approaches of this third class derive political obligations from the natural duties emerging in virtue of our humanity. However, theories of natural duty are primarily criticized by being incapable of satisfying the particular requirement. Without the assistance of other principles, for example, the proximity relationship with near others instead of distant others, they struggle in explaining why obedience is aimed at one's own state. However, natural duty theories leave room for the possibility of having political obligations towards multiple states. Hence, the conception of natural duty is not attached to a fixed view of the political community, and it is permissive to multiple obligations. It serves the best for an approach that aims at understanding and explaining the political obligations of non-citizens as well. The underlying argument of natural duty theories is the necessity argument that claims that states are necessary for offering important human goals. According to the more instrumental Hobbesian argument, only the state can guarantee order and security. This is the argument of Wellman and Renzo, while the Kantian approach associates an inherent value to the state because it plays a role in realizing relationships of justice, argues, for example, Rawls, Waldron, and Stills. Theories of natural duty demonstrate that the state can guarantee these goods, such as well-being or justice, if individuals obey its laws. Therefore, it is our natural duty to obey the laws. Among the theories based on well-being, the most famous is Wellman's Samaritan approach. This Samaritan account requires positive duties of rescuing others from the perils of insecurity and instability. This is only possible through obedience to the state. However, in this case, it is not shown why the generality of subjects are obligated to obey. It is enough if some individuals obey the state and therefore take part in maintaining the basic conditions of well-being. In resolving this problem, Wellman invokes the principle of fairness to show that everyone is obligated to take their fair share in benefiting others with the advantages of well-being. Note that the fairness principle solves the particular direct requirement as well. To take one's fair share in a cooperative scheme, one has obedience to that particular cooperative scheme. With the fairness principle, however, a cost-benefit calculation necessarily enters into the Samaritan argument. Fairness cannot require individuals to pay a relatively high cost for maintaining such a state. So Wellman argues the implication to migration is that there is a built-in mechanism in Samaritanism to limit immigration. In this solution, the discussion of the case of non-members of a society will always presuppose a bounded view of the political community, where non-members can enter only if their entrance has no excessive costs on existing members. This solution tells us little about the nature of obligations of migrant figures and the way that non-members become obligated. It is also obscure about the possibility of having political obligations towards multiple states. The Kantian solution is much more informative in this regard. First, Waldron's solution solves the particularity requirement easily by referring to the Rawlsian formula that implies that the natural duty is owed to institutions that apply to us, therefore to one's own state. Second, Waldron makes explicit remarks about cases of movement, primarily the case of a visiting tourist. He claims that besides natural duties of justice, there can be acquired obligations through a non-member's own conduct, such as entering into a state's territory, applying for visa, or even by temporarily or permanently residing there, taking a fair share of the benefits of social cooperation. The main argument here is that natural duties of justice have a limited scope. It applies only to those who are insiders or become insiders by getting into contact with the political system. Moreover, as Waldron argues, besides being particular, natural duty explains why an individual has a universal duty not to undermine a political system anywhere, why theories of acquired obligation face difficulties in answering this problem. Waldron explicitly knows the idea that political obedience one owes to a state may be composed by several layers. Therefore, in this approach, political obligations to multiple states are also allowed. So this approach might serve an appropriate starting point in understanding and explaining political obligations of non-citizens of a particular political community. The Kantian argument for natural duty serves as a basis also for the civil justice approach of Mokrashinska, although she classifies her approach as an associative theory. She resolves the particularity requirement in a way that she argues we have natural duties in virtue of our humanity, but they are manifested in political obligations of civil justice owed to fellow members of our political community, with whom we are standing in a special relationship. This approach also has exact implications for migration. When residents and visiting aliens come to stand in a special relationship with the citizens of a particular state, they acquire similar obligations as citizens have. In this case, the limited scope of the duty is invoked again. Acquired obligations pertain only until the special relationship exists. Concluding the argument, I demonstrated that a theory that reflects on the political obligations of non-citizens, especially migrant figures, should be found in the class of natural duty theories because they are consistent with a dynamic view of political community. I argued, however, that positive Samaritan duties have little to tell if applied to the case of migration. In contrast, Kantian theories of natural duty, with their permissive characteristic to multiple layers and aims of political obligations, may offer several insights for an approach of political obligation that takes human movement seriously and seeks to inquire political obligations of migrants as well. Thank you.